I'm 79 now, and for the past 12 years, I've lived by myself in a small house at the edge of a quiet street where not much changes except the seasons and the light. People hear that and they tilt their heads a little, soften their voices as if they're speaking to someone fragile. They say things like, "That must be difficult," or "Don't you get lonely?" I usually smile and give them something polite to hold on to because the truth is longer than most people have patience for. The truth doesn't fit into a quick answer at a grocery store or a passing conversation on the sidewalk. But if I'm being honest, it isn't difficult in the way they imagine. It took me a long time to understand that. My name is Eleanor, and for most of my life, I was a school teacher. I spent 38 years in the same elementary classroom, guiding children through reading and numbers and the small storms of growing up. Before that, I was a daughter in a busy house, then a wife, then a mother of 3. There was always noise, always someone needing something, always a schedule to follow. I believe that was what a full life looked like, being needed, being surrounded, being in motion. I believe quiet was something to be avoided, something that meant something had gone wrong. When my husband Thomas was alive, our days had a rhythm that didn't leave much room for questioning. Breakfast at 7, dinner at 6, television in the evening, lights out by 10. Weekends were errands, church, visits with family. It wasn't a bad life. It was steady, predictable, and in many ways comforting. But it was also built around habits that weren't entirely mine. I didn't notice that at the time. When you're younger, even middle-aged, you don't always separate yourself from the life you're living. You assume it all belongs to you. When Thomas passed, the house didn't just become quiet, it became unfamiliar. Not because anything had changed physically, but because the patterns that defined it were gone. The clock still ticked on the wall, the chairs were in the same place, the dishes were in the same cupboards, but the structure underneath everything had dissolved. People around me reacted quickly. My daughter offered her spare room before the funeral flowers had wilted. My son started sending me brochures for retirement communities. Former colleagues invited me to lunches and gatherings, as if filling my calendar would keep something from collapsing. I understood their concern, but what I felt wasn't fear. It was something closer to space. For the first time in my life, there was no one else's schedule pressing against mine, no one else's preferences shaping the day. And that realization came with a strange, quiet relief that I didn't dare speak aloud. It would have sounded wrong, maybe even cruel, but it wasn't about losing Thomas. It was about discovering something I had never allowed myself to experience. Still, I tried to do what I thought was expected. I said yes when people invited me out. I joined a reading group at the local library, even though I found myself more interested in the silence between the meetings than the conversations during them. I attended community events, sat through long afternoons of polite small talk, nodded at stories I had no connection to. I kept moving because I thought stopping would be dangerous. But the more I filled my time with these obligations, the more drained I felt. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was a kind of misalignment, like wearing shoes that didn't quite fit, but convincing yourself they were fine because everyone else seemed comfortable. I would come home from those gatherings more tired than I had ever felt sitting alone in my living room. And I began to notice that the loneliness people warned me about wasn't showing up when I was by myself. It appeared when I was surrounded by people I didn't truly connect with. One afternoon, after returning from yet another lunch that left me exhausted, I sat at my kitchen table and didn't move for a long time. The house was completely still. Sunlight came through the window in a way I had never paid attention to before, stretching across the floor in a slow, deliberate line. I realized I didn't want to go out the next day. There was a gathering I had agreed to attend, something I would normally force myself through out of habit. But sitting there in that quiet, I understood I didn't have to go, so I didn't. I made tea instead. I sat by the window and watched a pair of sparrows move between the branches of the tree outside. I stayed there longer than I meant to, doing nothing in particular, just noticing things the way the leaves shifted, the sound of a distant car, the feeling of the chair beneath me. It was such a small moment, almost insignificant, but it felt more genuine than anything I had done in weeks. That was the beginning of a different kind of attention. I started to ask myself simple questions. What time did I actually want to eat? When did I feel tired? What did I enjoy when no one else was around to influence the answer? The responses were often quiet and unexpected. I found I preferred later dinners, that I liked reading in the middle of the afternoon rather than at night, that I enjoyed sitting in silence without needing to fill it. These weren't dramatic discoveries. They wouldn't impress anyone, but they were mine, and that made them meaningful in a way I hadn't experienced before. I didn't stop seeing people entirely. I'm not sure that would have been right either. But I became more selective. I began to understand that connection didn't have to look like constant activity or large social circles. It could be smaller, simpler, and still deeply real. There was a man who walked his dog past my house every morning. At first we only exchanged nods, then over time it became a few words. Eventually we learned each other's routines without ever discussing them. If I was outside later than usual, he would notice. If he didn't pass by one morning, I would wonder if something had changed. It wasn't a friendship in the traditional sense, but it was a form of recognition. We existed in each other's awareness. There was also the librarian who began setting aside books she thought I might enjoy. She never made a big show of it. She would simply slide them across the counter with a small smile, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I never asked her to do that, but it meant something to me that she had noticed my preferences, that she had paid attention. These small threads of connection started to form a quiet kind of network around my life. Nothing overwhelming, nothing demanding, just enough to remind me that I was part of something, even in my solitude. For a long time, I had believed that being alone meant being cut off, that it was something to endure or avoid. But what I began to understand was that being alone could also mean being present. Present with your own thoughts, your own rhythms, your own way of moving through the world. It wasn't always comfortable. There were moments when the quiet felt heavier than I wanted it to. Moments when I reached for a conversation that wasn't there. But those moments passed, and in their place came something steadier. Not excitement, not constant happiness, but a kind of calm that didn't depend on anything outside of me. If I think back to my younger years, I realize how much of my life was spent reacting, responding to needs, to expectations, to responsibilities. There's nothing wrong with that. It's part of living, part of loving, but I never learned how to simply be without a role to play. Living alone taught me that, slowly and without any instruction manual. It wasn't something I set out to learn. It was something that revealed itself in the spaces I used to avoid. Now, when people ask me if it's hard, I still don't give them the full answer. Not because I'm hiding it, but because it takes time to explain. And most people aren't really asking for time. They're asking for reassurance, for something that fits into their understanding of the world. So I tell them I'm doing fine, and I am. But if I had the chance to say more, I would tell them that living alone isn't defined by absence, it's defined by what you discover in the absence. The way you learn your own habits, your own preferences, your own quiet joys, the way you begin to notice things that were always there but never fully seen. I would tell them that loneliness and solitude are not the same thing, even though we use the words as if they are interchangeable. Loneliness is a kind of disconnection, a feeling of not being seen or understood. Solitude, on the other hand, can be full. It can hold meaning, reflection, even a quiet kind of companionship with yourself. It took me nearly 8 decades to understand that difference, and I'm still learning it in small ways every day. There is a chair by my window now where I sit each morning with my tea. The same sparrows still come and go, though I imagine they are not the same ones as before. The light changes with the seasons, sometimes soft and pale, sometimes sharp and bright. I watch it all, not because I have to, but because I want to. And in those moments, I don't feel alone in the way people fear. I feel present. I feel grounded. I feel in a quiet and unremarkable way at peace. That may not be the story people expect to hear. It doesn't have grand events or dramatic turns, but it is real and it is mine, and after all these years, that feels like enough. I turned 81 the winter I finally understood the mistake I had been making. Though if you had asked me then, I wouldn't have called it a mistake. I would have said I was managing, that I had found a rhythm, that I knew how to fill my days well enough, and in a way, that was true. After Harold passed, I built a life that looked stable from the outside. My name is Leonard, and for most of my working years, I was a carpenter. I spent decades measuring things twice, cutting once, making sure everything fit the way it was supposed to. I believe life worked the same way, that if you planned carefully enough, if you kept everything in order, nothing would come undone. But life doesn't follow measurements the way wood does. It shifts, warps, changes shape when you're not looking. When I first started living alone, I treated it like a project. I made schedules, set routines, organized my time so there would be no gaps, no empty spaces where something uncomfortable might settle in. I woke up at the same hour every morning, made breakfast the same way, cleaned the same corners of the house on the same days. I told myself it was discipline. I told myself it was structure. What it really was, though I didn't admit it then, was avoidance. Because if I stopped moving, if I let the day stretch out without a plan, I had to face something I didn't know how to handle. Not grief exact that had softened into something quieter over the years, but a kind of question that had no easy answer. What was I doing now? Who was I without the work, without the role, without someone else depending on me in the way they used to? So I stayed busy. I even tried to build what people call a social life, though it never quite felt like mine. There was a group of men who met at a diner every Thursday morning. Most of them had backgrounds similar to retired tradesmen, men who had spent their lives working with their hands. I started joining them, thinking it would help, that maybe this was the kind of connection I was supposed to have. But sitting there, listening to the same stories told in slightly different ways each week, I felt like an outsider in a room I technically belonged in. They talked about their grandchildren, their health issues, the price of things going up. I nodded at the right moments, added a comment here and there, but I never left those breakfasts feeling fuller. If anything, I felt more aware of the gap between where I was and where I thought I should be. The same thing happened when I tried volunteering at a local workshop that repaired furniture. It sounded like something I would enjoy. And for a while, I did enjoy the work itself, the sanding, the fitting, the quiet focus of fixing something broken. But the social part of it, the expectation that we would all become something like friends, never quite settled right with me. I kept thinking there was something wrong with me for not wanting what everyone else seemed to want. I remember one particular afternoon that stands out more clearly than the others. It was late autumn, the kind of day where the air feels thin and the light fades earlier than you expect. I had spent the morning at the workshop and came home more tired than usual. Not physically, me hands still knew what to do. Something in me felt worn down. I sat in my living room looking at the tools I had lined up neatly along the wall. For years they had defined me. Each one had a purpose, a function, a reason to exist. And suddenly I realized I didn't know what my purpose was anymore. Not in a dramatic sense, not in a way that made me panic, but in a quiet, persistent way that didn't go away when I tried to ignore it. I thought about all the routines I had built, all the ways I had structured my days, and it occurred to me that none of them actually answered that question. They just kept me from asking it. That was the realization, though I didn't fully understand it yet. In the weeks that followed, I started noticing things I had overlooked before. Not big things, small details, the kind you don't pay attention to when you're focused on keeping everything in order. There was a bench at the end of my street where an older man would sit every afternoon, no matter the weather. I had passed him countless times without really seeing him. One day, for no particular reason, I stopped. We didn't have much of a conversation. He said hello, I said hello back. We talked about the weather for a minute or two. It wasn't meaningful in the way people often define meaning, but when I walked away, something felt different, not better exactly, but less contained. I started sitting on that bench occasionally, not every day, not even regularly, but enough that it became part of my awareness. The man was there most of the time. Sometimes we spoke, sometimes we didn't. There was no expectation, no obligation, just a shared presence. And that's when I began to see the mistake more clearly. I had been treating my life like something that needed to be filled, managed, controlled. I thought the goal was to eliminate emptiness, to make sure there was always something happening, something to point to as proof that I was still engaged with the world. But all that effort had created a different kind of emptiness zone that came from doing things without any real connection to them. The routines weren't the problem, the activities weren't the problem. It was the reason behind them. I was using them to avoid something instead of letting them be something. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I started making small changes, though they didn't feel like changes at the time, more like adjustments. I stopped going to the diner every Thursday, not because there was anything wrong with the men there, but because I realized I was going out of obligation, not desire. I reduced my time at the workshop, keeping only the hours that I genuinely enjoyed. At first, that left more empty space in my days, and I won't pretend that was easy. The question I had been avoiding came back clearer than before. What am I doing this for? There wasn't an immediate answer. For a while, I sat with that discomfort. I let the days unfold without trying to control them too tightly. Some mornings felt aimless. Some afternoons stretched longer than I liked. I had moments where I wondered if I had made a mistake by stepping back from the routines that had at least given me structure. But in that space, something else began to emerge. It happened gradually, almost quietly enough to miss. The man on the bench and I started talking a little more. I learned that his name was Victor, that he had been a bus driver for most of his life, that his wife had passed a few years before mine. There was no dramatic bonding, no deep confessions, just a slow accumulation of shared moments. One day he didn't show up. I noticed it immediately, though I hadn't realized how much I had come to expect his presence. The bench looked the same. The street was unchanged, but something was missing. I told myself it was nothing, that he was probably just busy or not feeling well. But the next day he wasn't there either. That's when I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. These small, quiet connections, they mattered more than I had given them credit for. Not because they were intense or life-changing, but because they were real. They existed without effort, without performance. I asked around a bit, spoke to a neighbor who lived nearby, and found out Victor had been taken to the hospital. Nothing life-threatening, just something that needed attention. I don't know what made me do it, but I went to visit him. It felt strange at first, walking into a hospital room for someone I barely knew in the traditional sense. But when he saw me, there was a recognition in his expression that made it clear I hadn't overstepped. We talked for a while about nothing in particular, the same kind of conversation we would have had on the bench. When I left, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't just passing time anymore. I wasn't just managing my days. I had, without planning it, become part of something again. Not in a large, overwhelming way, but in a way that felt grounded and genuine. That was the realization I had been moving toward without knowing it. Purpose doesn't come from filling every moment. It doesn't come from forcing yourself into spaces that don't feel right. It comes from the small, often unnoticed connections that give your time a sense of direction. I had spent years thinking I needed to build something significant to replace what I had lost, but what I actually needed was much simpler. I needed to allow space for something real to form. These days, my life still looks quiet from the outside. I still live alone. I still have routines. But they're different now. They're not there to keep something at bay. They're there because they fit. I still work with my hands sometimes, fixing small things around the house or helping a neighbor when they need it. I still value my time alone, but I no longer see that time as something separate from connection. It's part of it. If there's one thing I wish I had understood earlier, it's this. You can't force meaning into your life by filling it with activity. Meaning has to grow out of something real, something that matters to you, even if it's small. It took me a long time to see that. Longer than I would have liked, but I suppose that's the way with most things that matter. I'm 86 now, and I don't rush through my mornings anymore. Not that there's anywhere to rush to. The house wakes up slowly, the way I do, with light slipping through the curtains and settling gently across the floor. My name is Samuel, and before all of this, before the quiet, before the long afternoons and unhurried evenings, I was a train conductor. 42 years on the rails, always moving, always on schedule, always with a destination in mind. Back then, everything had a direction. You started in one place, you ended in another. There was a map, a timetable, a reason for every stop along the way. I believe life worked like that too. You followed the track in front of you, trusted it would take you somewhere meaningful, and didn't spend too much time wondering about the stretches in between. When my wife Lillian was alive, we had that same sense of movement. Even when we weren't going anywhere in particular, it felt like we were headed somewhere together. After she was gone, that feeling disappeared. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, like a train slowing down over miles before it finally comes to a stop. For a long time, I didn't know what to do with that stillness. I tried to treat my days the way I had treated my work, structured, predictable, controlled, wake up at the same time, eat at the same time, take my walks at the same time. I thought if I kept everything running on schedule, I wouldn't notice that there was no real destination anymore. But the truth has a way of settling in no matter how you arrange things around it. I remember a particular evening, maybe 6 or 7 years ago now. I had just finished dinner, something simple, I don't even remember what, and I sat down in my chair by the window. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to make me uneasy. And for once, I didn't turn on the radio, didn't reach for a book, didn't try to distract myself. I just sat there, and the thought came to me clear as anything: this is it. Not in a bleak or hopeless way, just a recognition. This is what my life looks like now. No big responsibilities waiting for me tomorrow. No one depending on me to keep things running. No schedule that matters beyond what I decide it should be. For a moment, it felt like standing on an empty platform after the last train had left. Quiet, open, uncertain, but then something shifted. I realized I had been looking at my life as if something was missing, as if the purpose had already passed and I was just filling time until the end. I had been measuring my days against what they used to be, against a version of life that no longer existed, and of course it didn't measure up. It was never going to. That was the mistake. I had spent years thinking purpose had to be something large, something defined, something you could point to and say, that's what I'm here for. A job, a role, a responsibility, something that gave your life a clear direction. But sitting there in that quiet room, I began to understand that maybe purpose wasn't something you followed like a track. Maybe it was something much smaller, something you created moment by moment without even realizing it. The next morning, I woke up without any particular plan. No list, no schedule beyond the basics. I made my coffee, as I always do, and sat by the window. There's a tree out front oak, been there longer than I have, and I started paying attention to it in a way I hadn't before. There were birds, of course, there had always been birds, but I had never really watched them. Not the way they moved, not the way they came and went, not the small patterns that repeated day after day. That morning I noticed one in particular, a little gray one, with a habit of hopping along the same branch before flying off. It didn't mean anything, not in the grand sense, but I found myself looking for it the next day, and the day after that, and somehow that became part of my morning. Around the same time, a boy moved into the house across the street with his parents. Couldn't have been more than 10 or 11. He started riding his bicycle up and down the road in the afternoons, sometimes stopping near my fence to catch his breath. At first we didn't speak, just a nod here and there. Then one day his chain slipped off the bike. I saw him struggling with it, hands getting dirty, frustration building. Old habits don't really leave you, not completely. I went over, took a look, and showed him how to fix it. It wasn't complicated, just something you learn after years of working with things that break and need mending. After that, he started stopping by more often. Not always for help, sometimes just to talk. About school, about his friends, about things that probably didn't matter much in the long run, but mattered a great deal to him in the moment. I didn't plan for that, didn't go looking for it, but there it was. And that's when the understanding settled in deeper than before. Purpose doesn't arrive as a single defining thing. It doesn't announce itself or demand your attention. It shows up quietly in small moments, in simple connections, in the act of noticing and being noticed. For me, it's in these small routines now. It's in the mornings with my coffee and the birds, watching that gray one hop along the branch like it always does. It's in the afternoons when I see that boy ride past, sometimes stopping to wave, sometimes coming over to tell me about something that happened at school. It's in the occasional conversation with the woman next door when we both happen to be outside at the same time, talking about the weather or the way the seasons seem to change faster every year